Welcome everyone. Today I have three esteemed guests joining me to talk about the relationship between psychology, philosophy, and other empirical disciplines. So I have Joshua Rottman from Franklin Marshall College, Chris Olivola from Carnegie Mellon University, and Daryl Leben from University of Pittsburgh, Johnstown. And so the thinking was today we're going to emphasize kind of the diversity of the disciplinary backgrounds each of you bring to bear on topics about ethics and morality. And one of the first questions that comes up when we think about some of this work is how do you see the relationship between empirical science and normative ethics? Like how has your work kind of straddled that divide, and kind of what do you think about the possibilities for traction there? Did you want to start?
Sure. So I'm a psychologist. I think much more about the is than the ought generally. But my aims in being part of moral psychology and thinking about the topics I think about are really to kind of explore these questions that are going to have some implication for normative ethics. And so something that I tend to kind of err on the side of is thinking that most of the time what is not going to have much influence on what ought to be, and in many cases it's actually going to debunk what we believe ought to be the case. So that the more we find out about how our moral minds work, the more we might want to be skeptical about some of the conclusions we come to about how we ought to act. But I also think that by understanding our moral psychology, we can start to really get traction on how we can utilize our tendencies for good and really capitalize on those and leverage them to create better outcomes. And then once we discover certain kinds of biases, we can figure out how to try to suppress those or override them in some kind of way, so that we're not necessarily translating from what is to what ought to be, but we're using the tools of how we can understand what is the case, these descriptive explanations of how our minds work, to start coming to conclusions about how we can shape them for other kinds of conclusions we've made in other ways about how we ought to act. So that's my disciplinary bias.
So I'm also mainly a psychologist, but the subfield that I've identified with judgment decision making, which is kind of at the intersection of economics, is interesting because it's also mostly an is, or as we say, descriptive field about how people behave. But for historical reasons tied to economics and probably theory, it does have these kind of normative benchmarks, different ones. And what's interesting is the field of judgment decision making, I think, breaks down into the judgment side, with the benchmark is something like, is a person properly applying probability theory, or are they actually predicting an event that we later know did or didn't occur or something, right? So there is a kind of an ought aspect to it. The other normative benchmark on the decision-making side is the economic concept of rationality, where it's not that a person can be right or wrong based on any single decision, but it's the sort of collection decisions, are they consistent or not? So you have these two different benchmarks, one where you can say for any given judgment, this person is right or wrong, because the event, they were accurate or not. And another where you can't say for anything like they were wrong to choose this over that, but the combination of their choices might be consistent or inconsistent. And what's interesting, what I see with morality, moral psychology, is that there is an ought that's sort of treated a little bit like the first kind, the kind of that's wrong to choose this versus that. But I find that it's I don't know, it's a little bit puzzling to me that it's a clear cut. I feel like sometimes what's interesting is the inconsistencies on the morality side, whether or not we agree on what the person should have done. But the field seems to be somewhere in between the two, or I don't know, that's my perception. So that's how I'm coming at it based off.
So I'm a philosopher, and most of my work is on the side of the ought. But I am very interested in how the ought and is relate to each other. So when I teach an intro to ethics class, what we'll be talking about here are 5 or 6 different moral theories. Here's what each of them say about some topic. Let's say prostitution. Utilitarianism says, well, as long as everybody's happy and no one is harmed, it's okay. Immanuel Kant says, no, it's a violation of your dignity, and so even if people agree to it, it's still somehow destroying yourself as an agent. Other theories like natural rights theory say, well, as long as it's consensual, then it's acceptable, and then we have to talk about what consent is. So that's all on the ought side. But a big problem in ethics, the biggest problem in ethics, is which moral theory is correct? How do we pick from amongst these? And there's an old idea in ethics, going back to Hume, that we can't easily move from just here's what everybody actually thinks to here's what people ought to think. So just because people think that slavery or child abuse is acceptable doesn't mean it actually is acceptable. They're just, like you were saying, incorrect. However, where do the oughts come from? That's one of the foundational questions in ethics. And if we're a naturalist about the physical world and our place in it, that is, we think human beings are made of the same physical stuff as everything else in the world, then there must ultimately be some way of moving from the is to the ought, if ought exists at all. And so there can't be a simple route to it, but there has to be some route to it. And the question is, what is that route? And that's where I think perhaps, and I know we want to talk about this at some point, where I think talking about the adaptive function of moral judgments can bridge that gap. But there are other ways that it can take place.
So something that I really love about your work is that you point out a lot of really irrational kind of decisions that people make, that they think that it's much better to martyr yourself and to pay all of these kinds of costs in order to raise benefits later on, even though from a consequentialist kind of point of view that doesn't make sense. Do you think that, so you're kind of using rationality as your benchmark for what we ought to do, in my understanding, or are you using more of a moral kind of utilitarian theory?
So for that particular finding, this is the finding that people, let's say, prefer someone who suffers and goes help people in person and ends up having a smaller impact, let's say, saves fewer lives by suffering. They prefer that to someone who kind of stays at home and, let's say, sends a check and saves more lives. I would say that violates, on most theories that I can think of, seems to violate. So if you're a utilitarian, it's a double violation because you're helping fewer people and you're also harming yourself. So from many moral, I guess, I would think moral philosophical point of view, that would be like a violation, or how do you say, would be irrational, if you will. But from an economic point of view, we're supposed to maximize, neoclassical economics, where you're supposed to maximize, let's say, your own utility, doesn't make any sense to, like, suffer. Those situations I think are interesting because there's no, usually when you have these moral dilemmas, you have a trade-off between goals, like I want to, help other people, but I also don't want to, like, spend my own money, right? Here is a situation where there's no conflict, it seems, and yet people still feel very strongly about this kind of thing. So now you could come up with, in economics, they can always have utility for anything, right? You could say, oh, people have a utility for suffering, that's it, we're done. I mean, it would, it kind of go against some people's intuitions and older models, but there is an aspect to it, or it can be circular. And I think maybe that could be an issue, and I could imagine that being an issue in some aspects of moral philosophy, where you can have a moral theory that just says, it basically, the concept of what's moral is so flexible that you can make it like whatever people do is moral, and what they think is moral is what they'll do. And there's some form of economic theory of expected utility that's basically like that. That's almost unspecifiable in that way. The only way to show it's wrong is by showing inconsistencies in people's choices. Then you're saying there's something wrong with a theory that assumes people are going to be consistent.
This is actually important in ethics, consistency, because a lot of the times it's actually a very powerful way of getting people to change their minds, is by just showing that their own beliefs are inconsistent. This is a really powerful argument in ethics, especially with things like animal rights. If you say, well, you think it's wrong to kill and eat dogs and cats, but it's okay to kill and eat cows and chickens, why? Right? You think it's okay to kill and eat farm animals, but not humans, why? And they'll propose these suggestions like, well, there are different species, and you'll say, well, so if Mr. Spock arrived on Earth, then we could kill and eat him. And they'll say, well, no, it's because they don't have higher intellectual abilities, and so we can kill and eat young children. And so just forcing them to be consistent is extremely powerful. But I think it can narrow down a range of moral theories, but it can't ultimately select from amongst a set of consistent theories. There are a set of very good moral theories that we need some sort of external measurement, like you were saying, some sort of measurement of utility. But what is that utility function for moral theories? It clearly can't be self-interest in the case of classical economics, because I think most of us want to say that moral judgments can go against your self-interest, can tell you to give up your slaves even if it's not good for you. So what is that outside measurement?
So I think this is fascinating, considering different benchmarks for what progress might look like in terms of moral development, moral education. I mean, I guess a follow-up to that would be, do you see any possibilities or plausible ways forward for augmenting human morality? So what are the lessons we can learn from either theorizing or from the empirical sciences to try to understand how we can improve on human moral agency? And that means things like, attending to the relevant details that should factor into the kinds of decisions we make about these situations.
So I think the empirical science is going to not have a ton to say about what those benchmarks should be necessarily, but part of the reason that I study moral development and try to understand the ontogeny or the initial formation of a lot of children's beliefs is because I do really feel like understanding that kind of trajectory is going to be crucial. So there's a biologist 100 years ago, Darcy Thompson, who published a book called On Growth and Form, and said everything is the way it is because it got that way. And I think that really simple kind of phrase drives a lot of how I think about this. So if everything is going to turn out the way it is because of some sort of process of development or evolution or change, it's only by understanding descriptively, empirically, the way that we can form certain kinds of beliefs that we'll be able to push those beliefs around to get to certain benchmarks. So yeah, I can't say too much from my own research about where those benchmarks should be, but I think by understanding the biases and the ways in which we develop in ways that are kind of conforming to ideas that are maladaptive for the greater good, we can start to figure out how to intervene and change some of those ideas.
My response to that question, the question you posed would be, and tying that to what Josh was saying, I think it depends on, so if we see people not behaving as morally as we think they should, or even that they themselves think that they should, right? So let's say we come to an agreement that people could be better in some dimension, some way. In terms of how do we get them there, I think the question depends on what's the source of that, why is there that gap, right? And I think, broadly speaking, I kind of distinguish three broad sources of moral failures, if you will. So one would be, the one that would be the hardest to overcome is if they sort of knowingly, this would not be in the case where they're thinking they're not acting as morally as they think. They think they're acting perfectly morally, or they just whatever. So if people just have a quote-unquote rational or consistent preference, let's say, for cheating or lying or slavery, and it's not out of ignorance or biases, that's going to be hard to overcome. That's going to take generations. Then that's where you need the institutional level or generational shifts in education. So that's going to be the hardest one to tackle. But I think many of the important problems in the world, unfortunately, are that. Another, I think, major source is ignorance or growth. So maybe people aren't donating enough money to worthy causes because they don't realize the amount of need out there. And that's a relatively easy one to tackle. You got to inform people. I mean, informing people is not easy necessarily, but and then the third class of I would say obstacles is the one that I would focus on most, are these more cognitive biases, where people, it's not that they have a strong preference to be selfish, let's say, or that they're ignorant about the need out there. So they know that they want to be better, but they can't, due to self-regulation or kind of cognitive blind spots, they can't kind of get there. I think that's where behavioral scientists would come in and try to find little tricks or nudges for first identify those obstacles and then to try to find little nudges or tricks to get them there.
Yeah, you mentioned educating people, just providing them with information. And as a moral philosopher, at least, my maybe naive hope is that, well, if you have people come in and take an intro to ethics class and actually try and justify their beliefs, then perhaps that will help them actually change their activities, change their lifestyle in some way. But unfortunately, there's this literature from behavioral economics having to do with motivated reasoning, and it seems like oftentimes there's this backfire effect, where if you challenge people on their beliefs, very often that they'll only dig in their heels further and become more resistant to counter evidence. And this is something that happens with even factual claims about climate change or evolution, and this is something that we want to avoid. I mean, if we have crossed the is-ought gap somehow, and we have decided that individuals have obligations to eat fewer animals, to make more contributions to charity, to drive hybrid or electric vehicles when they can, or something like that, how do we get people to change their actions? Well, my naive hope is just tell them about the harm that it's doing. But I'm worried that, as you were pointing out, it might have to be more indirect, this idea of a nudge, providing some kind of incentive or disincentive indirectly.
So clearly this is a very challenging problem, and I think this conversation has nicely illustrated how it kind of requires multiple disciplinary perspectives and people talking like this to really kind of navigate these complex challenges. So I want to thank all three of you for joining